Good morning. Welcome into Unpaid Interns. It is Monday, November 23rd. It is almost Thanksgiving, and it was quite a feast on Saturday for Big Ten football fans as IU narrowly fell to Ohio State in what is a game I think Indiana fans will remember for a long, long time. A thriller of a game. So much to talk about and recap. And we have a great guest to come on and talk about it. Dr. Galen Clavio, the director of the IU sports media program at the media school. He also hosts the podcast Crimson Cast, talking IU football and basketball, joins us today. Dr. Clavio, how you doing on this Monday morning?
I'm great, Griffin. Good to see you, and thanks for having me on.
Of course, and I'd be remiss to not mention before we start, Dr. Clavio is kind of the reason this podcast is going. We're able to use this technology. So a big thanks for that, for allowing me to do this. 3 days a week. It's been a lot of fun so far.
I consider myself a proud dad, podcast dad, I guess. So I'm glad you're doing the show. It's great to see, and I've loved all the guests you've had on here lately, including myself, I guess.
You got to be one of the best ones, no doubt about it.
I don't know about that, but no, it's good to be here, and I'm glad that things are rolling along smoothly. It's tough, as you know. In COVID year 2020, it's hard doing a lot of broadcast stuff in person. So I'm glad we've got this technology at our disposal. Hat tip to Trisha Whitaker, one of our sports video instructors, who is also the sideline reporter for the Tampa Bay Rays. She was the reason that we knew about this in the first place. So.
Oh, we had her on as a guest too, of course, earlier or a couple of weeks ago. So, I mean, it's been a great way, especially for someone trying to get into broadcasting like me, to continue getting those reps when it's been tough. Anyways, let's talk about the IU game on Saturday. You were very high on this Indiana team really all season, and you actually picked them to win the game. They end up losing 42-35. I mean, were you satisfied with their performance? What was your reactions to what was a really fun game to watch?
Yeah, look, I think the big question mark around IU football for the longest time has not been whether they could stay close with a team like Ohio State for a half or even three quarters. It was whether they could play a full game. And you can kind of make an argument they didn't entirely play a full game because they really struggled in the first half on both sides of the ball. But the way that they came back in the second half and made it a game and made Ohio State sweat and caused questions about Ohio State's overall quality, especially in the defensive secondary. I think that it's certainly not a game I'm going to throw back. It's one of those where, I would have loved it if they'd won. I think if they make one or two fewer mistakes, maybe they do win. I felt confident enough in this team because of their resilience, the way that they've showed over the course of the season that they're able to fight and continue to fight throughout the course of the game, whereas prior vintages of IU football weren't always known for that. So, overall was satisfied with things and, wish they'd had an extra 5 minutes or so. They might have been able to get the thing pulled off.
IU really outplayed Ohio State in the second half. And you mentioned it last year, IU was trailing Ohio State by a similar result, I think about 17 points at the half. And, that game was over in the third quarter. Ohio State ended up winning 51-10. And I guess the question is, most of the same players. What has changed in this program in a year that you can go from being blown out of the water from Ohio State to being the better team in the second half against them?
Belief in themselves as a unit. And I think that one of the overarching themes of IU football for many, many years, decades, it has been the feeling that IU doesn't really belong on the same field. And there's always that lingering doubt. And you could see it in past vintages of IU football, in the body language of the team, in the way that they reacted to adversity, in the way that they just didn't measure up. There have been cases where IU has just been significantly less talented. And I think, Ohio State's certainly a team that, if you look at the recruiting rankings and the types of players they get in, it's an insane amount of talent compared to what IU's got. But the difference in this team is that they really do believe in themselves. And that really comes back to the coaching staff and the way that Tom Allen and his staff have been able to instill that sense of belief, that sense of belonging, and that sense of, if we keep fighting all the way through, good things are going to happen to us. So look, they still didn't beat Ohio State, and that, so that sort of thing's only going to take you so far. And there's still a lot to clean up in terms of not making mistakes and not committing, silly penalties or costly turnovers. But the belief really is where it has to start. And I think you look across the board at the programs in the conference that have gone from being bad football programs to being good football programs. So much of it centered around that issue of belief. And, you know, whether you're talking about a program like Northwestern, who went from being the laughingstock of the conference in the 70s and 80s and early 90s to going to a Rose Bowl and now being a consistent bowl entrant, to, you know, a program like Wisconsin, who was also not very good and became very good, largely not because they were getting 4- and 5-star recruits, but because they started to believe in what they were doing. They had a system that they used that worked. That's, I think, what you're looking at here with IU. And I think it's cool to watch it develop because we've all seen enough of IU football where they haven't had that it's a tangible difference. It's almost like shocking to see it on the field now. And it's like, that doesn't look like IU football. And that's what you're going for. It's like there had to be a change of pace.
Yeah, it was interesting. We had Lisa Byington on the show last Monday, and she covered Michigan State football when she was working in Michigan, and actually kind of compared it to the Mark D'Antoni days. And he came in East Lansing, and the team kept on falling just short, similar to Indiana. They had their breakthrough in the early 2000s, and then, you know, end up kind of being a powerhouse program and make the college football playoff. So it seems like Indiana potentially, and it felt like this game kind of proved that they have the ability to go down that path.
Yeah, no, look, there's nothing in the water in Bloomington that says that you can't have a successful football team here. It's never happened really for any length of time. We've had some peeks into it. Obviously, the Bill Mallory era, which I was alive for. I remember that period from like 1986 to 1994, where the idea that you were going to have a 2-9 season or a 1-10 season just wasn't around. And then that went away. And, you know, for really from about 1997 until, you know, really about 2013, 2014, it was this long climb back upward. But so much of the football program's success really just comes down to doing things the right way, believing in yourself, and getting, you know, being able to develop players that are underrated in the recruiting process. Like you think about the main players on this team, these were not 5-star athletes that everybody was going after. In fact, you can make the argument that some of the most highly recruited players on this roster haven't really performed that highly. Samson James has struggled, this year. You've seen some, I don't want to single him out, but there's other players where it's like, you know, it's not the 4- or 5-star guys that IU is relying on. It's guys like Micah McFadden, or it's people like Ty Freifogel, who was a very lightly regarded recruit. Peyton Hendershot didn't have a huge number of offers. Those kinds of players, if you can develop them, are going to be as good as, or good enough at least, to match up with the players that Michigan's throwing out there or Ohio State's throwing out there, if you know what you're doing.
I guess the last question, kind of big picture, before we delve a little bit into more specifics of what happened in the game, is just, what do you feel like the game, especially the way IU played in the second half, did as a statement to the college football world? I mean, what shocked me was after the game, LeBron James' tweet about Indiana football. I mean, if someone at the beginning of 2020 told me LeBron James was tweeting about Indiana football, I really would have questioned what was going to happen this year.
Yeah, I mean, that and Stephen A. Smith tweeting about Ty Freifogel. And I mean, look, it's so important for recruiting to have those kinds of moments. And if you think about who gets the players all the time, it's the teams that are on television. It's the teams that are getting talked about on social media and on ESPN. And look, IU demonstrated they belonged in the conversation. They demonstrated they're certainly a top 15 team. I actually thought it was kind of harsh that they got dropped out of the top 10. I was always like, well, wait, you went on the road and you covered the spread against the number 3 team in the country, and then you drop 3 spots? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But it doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things. What matters is IU football mattered. IU football was a program that for 3.5 hours was at the center of the college football universe. And that is a huge thing down the line, because that puts you in the minds of recruits. It puts you in the minds of parents. And I tell you, even more than the LeBron James comment or the Stephen A. Smith comment, is all of the comments that I've seen from football people about, like Booger McFarland tweeted out something like, I wish I could go play for Tom Allen. Stuart Mandel from, I think he's from The Athletic now, or maybe it was Dan Wolken, one of the national writers, is like, if I could buy stock in a college football program, I would buy stock in Indiana University football. Those things do matter. That type of talk really does have an impact. And, older fans or people that are just watching the games and don't necessarily have a kid that is thinking about playing college football, maybe it doesn't matter to them as much. But to those parents, I think that does matter. And what they see, where they don't just see Tom Allen being emotional and his players saying that he loved them. They also see a football program that was able to go out and give Ohio State a legitimate scare for the fourth quarter on the road. So I do think it makes a big impact. Obviously, you have to capitalize on those things. It'll be interesting to see how IU and how Tom Allen are able to capitalize on it here in the coming years.
Joel mentioning on a comment on YouTube, it was the highest rated game of the day in college football. And I believe it was also the highest rated game of Fox in college football this year as well. So, I mean, I don't know if that's more Ohio State or people want to watch Indiana football and are catching on it. Those clips of Tom Allen on social media that they get almost 1 million views.
And at some point, it doesn't really matter why they're watching. It's just a matter that they're watching. And that is, it's such a sea change from what we're used to, where IU is an afterthought of afterthoughts. It's not a major game. And now, we started to see that change. It's not just the fact that they were the big noon Saturday game, but they've been, they were a middle of the afternoon game on ABC when they played Michigan State, Michigan. They were the noon game on ABC when they played Michigan State. They've been getting these really plum spots, and I think it's going to continue because it's an exciting team to watch.
The crazy thing is, I was thinking about this the other day. IU is probably not going to play a game on Big Ten Network all season long, which has certainly not happened since Big Ten Network's been around.
Yeah, I mean, it may be the bucket game. I could see that potentially just because there's going to be other games that are going on that day. But even, look, the fact that they've played so many games in key spots. I mean, you think about IU has essentially owned like the noon Big Ten Network kick, or maybe occasionally they're on ESPN2. And that just really hasn't happened over the course of the season so far. I think the Rutgers game might have been the only one that was in that category. The exposure matters. It really does. It's like, back in the day when we would play, NCAA football on PlayStation, there was a big difference between the regional network game and the national television game in terms of the recruiting points that you got. And that's essentially how it works in real life too.
Let's talk a little bit more about the specifics of the game. We got to talk about Michael Penix. What a performance. 491 yards passing. It was the most passing yards against an Ohio State team since 1985. I think we all knew he was extremely talented, but did you think he could have a performance like this against, I know not a secondary that's one of Ohio State's best, but still against some 4-stars and 5-stars and players that are going to play in the NFL?
I never questioned that Michael Penix had the talent to have a game like this, even against an Ohio State. I did question whether his offensive line would be able to give him enough time to do this. And I think the offensive line, on balance, in pass protection, had a really good game. That said, I don't know if you've seen the stat from Pro Football Focus that's been floating around, but since they started tracking the numbers, this was the most passing yards under pressure that a quarterback's had. And the guy that he eclipsed for that record was Patrick Mahomes. I mean,
he's okay at football.
He's somewhat decent. He had an okay game last night. Look, Penix, this is why it was so disappointing that Michael Penix's injuries kept him from being the full-time starter last year. Because even though Peyton Ramsey did an excellent job of coming in and filling that spot and being able to create opportunities for IU, and they ended up winning, 8 regular season games and got to the Gator Bowl. I watched the IU game and then I watched the Northwestern Wisconsin game back to back. And this is not a criticism of Peyton Ramsey. It's just a reality that when you look at the throws that Michael Penix is able to make under pressure, scanning the field, that throw he made to Freifogel for that last touchdown, the way he's able to spot receivers. And then you look at what Peyton Ramsey does, where Ramsey, he's a lot more laborious in terms of his reads. The ball doesn't come out as quickly, doesn't get there as quickly. It's still effective. Northwestern beat Wisconsin. But I would take Michael Penix, 10 times out of 10, not just over Peyton Ramsey, but over anybody in the conference right now, including Justin Fields, because the way that Penix has changed his game and has turned himself essentially into a straight up pocket passing quarterback. He's not scrambling. He's not trying to get out of the pocket. He's forcing himself to go through his reads. This is perhaps, it's certainly the most exciting quarterback in the Big Ten right now in terms of future potential. When it comes to just being a pocket passer, Justin Fields is kind of in a different category. I think Justin Fields will probably have a very good pro career, but the way that Penick was able to sling the ball around, the way that he was able to handle pressure, the fact that I think a lot of his numbers early on in the year, in some part, were because receivers were not able to catch the balls he was throwing. They seem to have worked on that a bit. And it's ended up creating a situation where you got to really like what you're seeing out of IU's passing attack, and it all comes back to him. And so the fact that he did it against Ohio State, it's not just that. He's done it against pretty much everybody except Penn State. And even there, if you look at what he did in the fourth quarter when he finally got his nerves settled, it's just remarkable performance after remarkable performance right now.
You're someone that knows a lot of IU football history. I mean, you teach it in classes, and big picture question, and it's still early in his career. He's not even started a full season of games yet. But is Michael Penix the best quarterback to ever play for Indiana?
I would say he's got the potential to be. I don't think he's there yet. I think it's tough because in terms of raw talent and ability, Dave Schnell is a guy in the 1980s that led IU to, three bowl games in a row, I guess it was, and was such a key component of that offense. But football was different back then. You had a rushing attack that featured Anthony Thompson. You were slinging the ball around a bunch, and he had a lot of. He was a 4-star quarterback that Miami wanted and several other people wanted, and he chose to come to IU. Antoine Randall was a guy that I grew up with, tremendously talented athlete. I think as far as a pure passer is concerned, I think you have to talk about Penix the same way you talk about Nate Sudfeld, and the same way that you talk about Kellen Lewis, who's a guy that doesn't get talked about much, had that one, great season in 2007 and then kind of flared out. But Penix has the ability right now to become the greatest quarterback that IU's ever had. Yes. And I think that he's in a fortunate era for it because IU was within 7 points of Ohio State, despite having -5 total rushing yards. You couldn't have done that 20 years ago. And so it's things are a little skewed by the era, but I'm really excited about the potential of Mike Penix and what he can do in terms of being the all-time greatest.
And last question on Penix. For the first time, I started seeing some media talk about NFL with him. He could hypothetically leave at the end of this year. He's a redshirt sophomore, so 3 years. How long do you see his IU career going if he came back next year, which I think most people think he would? Could he be in the Heisman Trophy conversation? And what's his NFL potential, too?
I think the sky's kind of the limit with Penix in terms of what he could do. A lot of people have said, he should be in the Heisman conversation this year. And that's not really how the Heisman Trophy works. You have to have some level of hype coming into the year. People have to be talking about you. People have to recognize you and your team as, I think, a major player. It's probably too late for that to be happening this year. But next year, if he comes back, and I think he should, because at the end of the day, I think he's only in his 12th start or something like that going into this week. You need a little more seasoning. If you had the chance to be drafted in the first round, I would say, son, go get drafted, go get paid. But I think another year would be really good for him, especially since he's going to have the exact same personnel setup. You could see Whop Phillier come back next year. You're going to see this offensive line mature and get a year older and a year better. You're going to see Ty Freifogel, back, provided now Ty might end up getting drafted. That's entirely a possibility. He's set the world on fire statistics wise. So maybe I'm being a little premature with that, but I think overall, yeah, he could be in the Heisman Trophy race next year. And because he's got an offense that's built around him, he's shown thus far that a lot of the questions about his health and his ability to stay healthy have been answered. Even the times that he's gotten dinged up so far this year, he's been able to get right back out there and do what he does. And as far as his draft potential, he's not a running quarterback. He's not like a Kyler Murray type, but he can move. We've seen him run around. I think he's been specifically told not to do that. But that level of versatility is what teams are looking for now. Someone that can throw the ball with his velocity, if they can work on his footwork, if they can put him in a system that allows him to succeed. That's a guy that, I mean, Damon Bruce, one of our alums and a guy that is a stalwart in San Francisco sports radio.
Grew up listening to him.
Yeah. He just tweeted out during, like, right after the game. It's like Michael Penick will be available for the 49ers in the second round of the draft this year. And he was kind of like deadly serious. Like this is the type of quarterback that gets people really excited. And I think IU fans should enjoy him while he's here. I'd love it if he was here for at least another season, but NFL's all about drafting on potential. And if they see a guy that can do the things that Michael Penix does on the field, they're probably not going to be inclined to want to wait. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But I think the sky's the limit for him on a number of levels.
Will be interesting. We've talked pretty much only positively so far about IU football, and there's not too many negatives. But if you do want to nitpick, and IU left some plays on the field that might have cost them the game, the 14-point turnaround at the end of the first half with the David Ellis fumble, and other mistakes too. A couple drops, a key one by Ty Freifogel early in the game on a fourth down, the key pick six by Michael Penix with Sean Wade. How do you reflect on those mistakes that have been apparent for IU football? Are they just kind of part of the game, or is that something that you think needs fixing?
I think the moment for a bit was maybe too big for IU. And look, Ohio State is a really good football team. They're a talented football team that will absolutely pounce on you if you make a mistake. And it's, the thing that was running through my head while those things were happening was this was a bad time for the old IU football to pop up. And that's just kind of the reality of the situation. If they didn't make those mistakes, I mean, who knows? It's, every football game is essentially the butterfly effect writ large. Like you can't say, well, gosh, if David Ellis doesn't fumble that ball at the end of the first half, then that automatically turns into, additional points for IU. It doesn't work that way. Like everything's a reaction to what the situation is. But IU, I think they've proven now that they can consistently beat teams that are worse than them or teams that are having worse seasons. Penn State, Michigan being good examples of that. The next thing is, okay, to win games like the Ohio State game, you have to not beat yourself. You have to make the other team beat you by executing rather than you doing something that gives them free points or takes you out of a position to score. And, I still think even with all of that, the fact that they were within 7 and had 2 drives essentially that they could have taken down the field and potentially scored on illustrates how far this team's come, but it also illustrates they've got more to go. And that's something that takes time. I mean, you can look at the development of most college football programs that have gotten good from being just average or poor, and there's always this transition point where they can't get over the hump. Clemson was like this. Like for years, Clemson, they made a lot of mistakes, and then they made fewer mistakes, but they couldn't get over the hump, and then they got over the hump, and now nobody talks about Clemson anymore as being a team that can't get it done. IU's going to have to be that kind of a program where it's going to take steps. It's not just a matter of, hey, we're here and we beat Ohio State and everything's cool. There's no shortcuts with all of this. And so it's just a matter of building off of it, showing people the tape and saying, this is why we lost the game. And it's not to be critical. It's not to make you feel bad, but realistically, we lost the game because of these fumbles and our inability to run the ball. And that is one of those things that, and maybe it's not those specific things they say, but you have to be able to point that out and work with your players and be positive about it, but say, this is how you fix it. And if you want the result to be different next time, don't make those mistakes.
Let's talk a little bit about the IU defense, especially in the first half. They really overwhelmed Justin Fields. He threw 3 interceptions on the day. He only had 3 interceptions in his career coming into the day. What were they able to do to make him so uncomfortable?
Well, I think one of the things that Kane Womack's done that I've been really impressed by is, despite not having an overwhelming defensive line, he's been able to use pressure coming in from different angles to make it essentially unclear what's going to be happening on any given play. The sad thing to me is, as well as IU's defense played and as much as they forced Justin Fields into those mistakes, they left so much on the field in terms of not tackling. I mean, they had him wrapped up in the backfield several times and he got free. And they had other situations with players where they could have tackled them and they didn't. But I think specifically the whole scheme for IU is essentially, can you keep the offense that you're playing against uneasy in terms of what they're trying to do, where they think pressure is coming from, whether you're going to blitz a corner or not, or whether you're going to drop a safety back another level and have them just sit there and watch the quarterback's eyes. Yeah, I think with Fields, he's obviously a talented player. He's a player that I think has a future playing on Sunday, but he's also a player that doesn't always have to rely on his arm because he plays for a team that's got such an overpowering running game. I mean, they're so good offensively when it comes to just the talent on the offensive line, the talent with their running backs. And IU is a real problem for teams that try to put the ball in the air. And I think we've seen that across the board. I mean, that was the big question coming in, was like, could IU force this guy that doesn't throw interceptions into throwing interceptions? And they did, because they know where to be on the field. They know how to position themselves. They know how to bait quarterbacks into making throws that are going to result in the safety coming across or just stepping up and picking it off. They know how to disguise themselves. And so I think that's really what it comes down to. I think that, for Fields moving forward, I don't know if he's going to play another defense like that. Certainly not this year. I'm curious to see what he does against Michigan State, because I think Michigan State's actually got a pretty good defense. Their offense is the problem. But Illinois, Michigan, I don't think either of those teams are going to give him much of a trouble. This will probably be the toughest game he plays until, the playoff, or this will probably be a more difficult game than they'll even face in the Big Ten championship game, because I don't see Northwestern or Iowa or Wisconsin or whoever they end up playing being able to play defense quite as well as Indiana did as far as the secondary is concerned.
I do have to say, on an Ohio State play like Michigan, I am concerned for all of our eyes trying to watch Ohio State's offense against that Michigan defense, because watching Rutgers walk all over Don Brown's defense, that needs like a 13 or older for anyone to be allowed to watch that game.
That was so wild. I mean, I was, I'd been watching football all day, and I've been kind of this hazy state on the couch, I'm getting ready to fall asleep. And I was like, what am I watching? Like, how is Rutgers just all over Michigan like this? It was actually kind of a shame that Rutgers lost that game. But so much of Ohio State this year, I think we're going to look back at the season and we're going to say, wow, Indiana was really legitimately the only team that they played in the conference until they got to the title game. And that's, it says a lot about Indiana, more so than it does to me about anybody else. This is just a year where Indiana is, the second or third best program in the conference. And that's a real testament to IU and what they've done during this whole process. And it is amazing watching like a Michigan or a Penn State just struggle with the basics this year. It's really fascinating.
It's been a strange year in the conference for certain. You mentioned the run defense. That was probably Indiana's biggest struggle, certainly defensively. 307 rushing yards allowed. And Ohio State really just kind of ran it down IU's throat for much of the game. Indiana couldn't stop it. How much is that a concern for you, especially when you think of Wisconsin, Northwestern, potentially if they are playing Wisconsin soon, maybe Northwestern in that Champions Week, or Wisconsin again, bigger, Iowa, maybe big lines, and then an SEC team such as a Georgia or an Auburn that also has big offensive lines that can run the ball.
I mean, it's always going to be a bit of a concern, but I think, it seemed like Indiana made a decision that they were going to really focus on stopping the passing game. And that was a questionable decision about halfway through the game, but it became less questionable as time went by, because they were able to make just enough stops on Ohio State's running game that even though they ran for a ridiculous number of yards, Ohio State only finished with 100 or so more total offensive yards than Indiana had. And so I think the Big Ten it's a weird environment this year in terms of Ohio State might be the only team outside of maybe Wisconsin that can effectively take advantage of that. But even with Wisconsin, we don't really know like how good are they actually? They got ranked very early on in the process. And then you look at who they beat. They beat Illinois and they won at Michigan. And then they turn around and they lose at Northwestern 17-7. And if you look at the way that they ran the ball against Northwestern, I mean, it was okay, but they averaged 3.4 yards a carry. They averaged 3.4 yards a carry against Illinois. Their rushing attack is largely living off of that ridiculous 6.7 yards a carry average that they racked up against Michigan. And I think that's much a bigger problem with Michigan. IU's always had trouble with Wisconsin. IU always has trouble against really big physical lines. But I also think that you can't just run the ball in college football these days. And that's, so now it's like, okay, yeah, you might be able to run against us, but you're not going to be able to do it exclusively because we have an offense that can score enough points that you're going to have to at some point put the ball in the air. And that's where IU's defense ends up coming through and taking advantage of things.
The run game on the other side was also not good for Indiana. You mentioned that as well. They had 27 yards gained, but with the net, with sacks and balls going over that, they finished with -2 net rushing yards, which is incredible that you can almost win a game with that. The consensus seems to be with many people at this point is that it's fine because they're just such a great passing team. Do you agree with that sentiment? Can this team just kind of pass the ball and Stevie Scott and Samson James can be pass blockers essentially?
I think that I don't think Indiana's that dedicated to running the football. And I get why. I mean, you've got so many great receivers and you've got a great quarterback. Why continue to try to do something that isn't necessarily moving the ball down the field? I think that if you're not going to run the ball, you probably need to have a shorter passing game to go along with your more intermediate passing game. And that does concern me a little bit. But look, the way that football has gone, the goal is not to run the ball. The goal is to move the ball down the field. And if you can do that more efficiently through the passing game, then maybe the running game doesn't matter as much. If they had rushed the ball for 30 or 40 more yards in the Ohio State game, would they have won? Probably not. I mean, I don't think that was the difference. I think that the issue was more the fumbles. They were moving the ball just fine, and then they lost it on turnovers. And so I do think that they need to do something to try to fix the running game. It really does look bad. And I think part of it is the backs that they've got. Like, they don't really have fast, shifty backs. They have backs that are very good straight ahead runners, guys that can, if you need 2 yards, you can throw Stevie Scott in there and he can get you 2 yards. But they don't have like the really speedy backs that I think you might need to combine with this particular offensive set. I also think that, the way that this season is going, they play Maryland, they play Wisconsin, they play Purdue. I think they're going to need to throw the ball against all three of those teams for various reasons. I think Maryland and Purdue are so based on the passing attack. You want to talk about a team that can't run the ball? Let's talk about Purdue, who is, that Minnesota game was like, their running game was an abomination there. That's just the way that football is now. So yes, I'd love to see IU run the ball more. I'm not overly concerned about it yet because they're still 4-1 and they're still in great position here for the season. So it hasn't really bit them yet.
So more big picture questions for you. Joel was asking about the IU coaching staff, and obviously they're getting a lot of attention. Revenue, he pointed out, is also down right now too. I know that's something you follow in college athletics. Can IU both, keep Tom Allen long-term, and you also look at, I think, especially Kane Womack, the defensive coordinator, are raises going to keep them around? Can IU afford to, give them a raise? Because even though Tom Allen just got a raise last year, you'd think he might merit another raise after, especially if his team finishes in the top 10 in the country.
I hate to break this to everybody, but good football is expensive. It's just the way that it is. Look, as far as the assistants are concerned and the staff in general, this is, people like what IU's doing and they want to grab pieces of that and take it with them. And I would be surprised if either Kane Womack or Nick Sheridan got competing offers this year for the same reason that Joel just mentioned. Revenue's down everywhere. So the idea that another school is going to splurge for a lot of money on, either coordinator, both of whom are under the age of 35, I think, seems a little bit questionable. Now, it could happen, certainly, but this is Womack's second full year as defensive coordinator, and he's doing great things. I'm really enjoying it, but you need a little more of a track record for a big program to say, we got to get that guy immediately. Nick Sheridan, same deal. where this is his first year as the offensive coordinator. And while the offense has certainly looked good, there are also some question marks about some things that are just young coach things that need to be worked out. So I look at it and I say to myself, they just went out and spent a bunch of money on a strength coach. I think that situation is going to be set for a while. You've obviously got some individual position coaches, but is this the budgetary year where, people are going to go and try to raid? The big question mark ends up being if there's if Harbaugh ends up leaving Michigan and, a new coaching staff comes in and they want to hire people, that's where you get potential for some turnover. But I also think that Tom Allen deserves a lot of credit for having hired the right people along the way. And when he's lost people, he's replaced them with people that are as good, if not better. So I'm not getting too bent out of shape about it right now. Ultimately, where IU is at in the food chain of college football, it's a good thing if your people are getting hired away, as long as you're able to replace them with good people. And you'll be able to do that if you're paying market rates, that's been the big issue for IU historically. Up until the last few years, I don't think that they've been willing to do that in many cases. Now they appear to be willing to do it, and I think that'll allow them to keep people around.
To that point, I mean, is Tom Allen here long term? Is this a Kirk Ferentz, Mark D'Antonio situation where he's here 20 years, or is it where Michigan comes calling in 3 years that he could leave, or another big program comes calling? Because everyone's paying attention to him now, and he's on SportsCenter every day.
I got asked this on another podcast, and my answer is essentially this: Indiana's not a destination job in college football. It could be, in the same way that Iowa was never a destination job. But it was funny because Kirk Ferentz has been around for 20 years. He replaced a guy that was also around for 20 years. Hayden Fry took over the Iowa job at a time when that was not a very attractive job, and he turned it into an attractive job. These are all special situations, and you never know what the motivation of someone is. Tom Allen got an opportunity to coach here at a time when probably nobody else in college football, at least not at the FBS, the power conference level, would have hired him as a head coach. I'm sure that goes for something. He's not the highest paid coach in the league, but he's not the lowest paid coach either. And so that certainly helps along the way. I don't know. I mean, look, if a Tennessee, or maybe Tennessee's a bad example, but if an Auburn came calling, I'd have a hard time turning that down. I mean, if you want, it depends on what your motivations are as a head coach. If your motivation is to build something that will stand the test of time and will demonstrate, will allow you to have it be entirely yours, stay at Indiana. If your focus is winning at the highest level, you'd go somewhere else. It may be a hybrid of those two. Allen's in kind of an interesting spot. He's not even 50 years old yet. He's still relatively young as head coaches go at that level. So I think, is he around a decade from now? I think if Indiana continues to pay and continues to upgrade the facilities, continues to upgrade the coaching staff salaries, that's what you need to do to have a competitive program. I could see him staying, sure. But I don't think that IU should take it for granted that just because Tom Allen loves Indiana and is from the state of Indiana and coached high school here, that he just will automatically stay. That's the kind of thinking that has led to problems for IU athletics in past decades. And so I hope that I'm certain that that's not how Scott Dolson and the staff over there are approaching things. But I think they need to keep that in mind, because this is going to be a guy who's a very hot commodity for a lot of programs, like Michigan being a great example. That's a program that, whether it's this year or next year, they're going to be at a crossroads. They're going to be looking for somebody just like Tom Allen to come in and reverse their fortunes. IU's going to have to be prepared to deal with that if they want to keep what they've started.
I tell you, watching Michigan this year, we're really just berating them in this podcast. But
well, they deserve it.
I know IU fans love to hate on Michigan, so I know they're enjoying this.
I mean, I don't wish Michigan any ill will, but Michigan football kind of reminds me of IU basketball in a lot of ways, where the level of historical success that they've had does not correspond to what's going on now. And that complacency has allowed a lot of their rivals to not just pass them, but lap them. The idea 20 years ago that Ohio State, in terms of talent, recruiting, success on the field, would be this far ahead of Michigan, you'd be crazy to think about. But that's exactly what's happened. Ohio State has just taken off, and Michigan's still pretty much where they were in 1998. So, I think that's where Tom Allen, for a lot of programs, they're going to look at what he's done, and they're going to see how transportable his message is and say, that's a guy that we really want to have on our sidelines. And IU's going to have to, again, they're going to have to do something to make sure that Allen knows that this is where he needs to be, and that he's not just that we want him here if you're IU, but also that we're going to give him all of the resources to do what a Barry Alvarez did at Wisconsin, or what a Kirk Ferentz has been able to do at Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, it's been Michigan doesn't look like they want to play, and Indiana is the absolute opposite of just, putting their heart and soul on the field. A couple more questions for you. It was a memorable game against Ohio State. Where do you just think it ranks on a historical basis of most important Indiana games, in the way that, as we talked about, it just proved what this new Indiana football team is on a national level?
I mean, I think it would have been more important like in the history of IU if they'd won. I mean, if we're going to go through and list out all the games that IU lost that were still important, it's up there. But it's not, like, to me, like, the Ohio State game was important because of what could have happened had they won. But the fact that they lost didn't derail them. They still have the opportunity to go 8-1 in the regular season if they beat their final three opponents. And I think it's entirely possible that they could beat Maryland, win at Wisconsin, and then beat Purdue at home. And then do something exciting in a bowl game, maybe get to a New Year's Six bowl. So it was important because they could have done more. They could have played in the Big Ten title game if they'd won the game. They didn't. That's okay. So it's probably, in the big scheme of things, going to be looked at more as an important game in that year. And certainly from a national perspective in the 21st century, it's the most high profile game they've ever played, but probably not that important in the huge scheme of things.
You mentioned the future. What makes an IU season a success this year? Is it going undefeated the rest of the way? Is it 8-1 in the regular season? Is it just winning that bowl game that they haven't since 1991?
It's some combination of those. I think, when we started the season, I predicted that they were going to go 6-2 in the regular season, and no one else was predicting that. I think everybody else was at 5-3 or 4-4. Somebody said 3-5 that I was talking with. I was like, come on. But I think what makes it a success in my mind is 6-2 in the regular season plus winning whatever that crossover game would be a tremendous season. And I think it's easy to have your expectations somewhat skewed. Winning 6 out of your 8 games. When was the last time Indiana won 75% of their games in a season? Like, it's rarely happened. And so the idea that wouldn't be successful is silly to me. I do think winning a bowl game is the next logical step, but even that, it's like, if you're in the Outback Bowl and you're playing, whoever the SEC team would be on that level this year, I don't know, maybe like an Auburn, for instance, that's still a tough ask. I mean, that's a really, really talented team that you're playing against. And if you're playing in like a New Year's Six bowl, if you're in the Peach Bowl against BYU or somebody like that, again, huge ask, a stage IU's never been on before. But if you're in the Music City Bowl, you need to win that bowl. If you're, you're not going to be in the Gator Bowl again, but if you're in that level of bowl where it's like, okay, we've been on this stage before, we didn't pull it off last time, we need to pull it off this time. I think that would do so much for IU programmatically that they need to be thinking along those lines. And so I think the biggest thing right now is take care of business the rest of the way, win the games you're supposed to. You have to beat Maryland at home. You have to beat Purdue at home. Like, there's no excuse for losing to either of those teams. And then put out the best possible effort you can at Wisconsin. And I mean, everybody talked about the 26-game losing streak that IU has against Ohio State. I got news for you. The second longest losing streak that IU's got in the conference is against Wisconsin. And they haven't beaten Wisconsin since 2001, I think it is. And so that's the other major dragon that you could slay this year would be this idea of, okay, yeah, we haven't beaten Wisconsin. I'm sorry, it's been on the road since 2001. They haven't beaten Wisconsin. I think they beat them at home in like 2006 or so. Still, it's been a long time. That has been a tormentor that, you don't play every year, and they still manage to beat the crap out of you almost every time. So if you could turn that around, that would make it a very successful year.
IU runs the table the rest of the way. It'd be a 9-win Indiana. So you'd get those t-shirts back out again. What is one key, though, that you see to reaching that, level of success that would make you satisfied? All that's on the field.
I mean, I think it's limiting mistakes, which they've largely been able to do. Like, it's been a mostly mistake-free year. And the Ohio State game was an outlier, but you would expect that against a team like Ohio State who can make you pay for mistakes. I think the other, to me, if they can keep turnovers down and if they can continue to execute regularly, then that's going to be a key to success. You'd worry if IU beats Ohio State, do they come out flat against Maryland? So they didn't do that. I don't think they're going to come out flat against Maryland. Now it's a matter of, can you keep that level of intensity throughout the course of the rest of the season? And I think that IU can play with almost anybody in the country, probably not Alabama or Clemson, but they've shown they can play against Ohio State. And I think they can play against anybody else if they have that level of intensity. And now they just need to go out and show it. And they've got 3 games left to do it in, we think. We'll see what happens with this Maryland game, obviously, whether it actually gets played. But that becomes the key now. It's like, all right, we've done this for 5 weeks. Can we sustain it for all 9 weeks? And where does that leave us going into the postseason?
All right, last one for you on IU football. Give me a prediction the rest of the season. How many wins, how many losses?
I think it'll be 7-2. I think that they'll either beat Wisconsin and maybe lose the crossover game to Iowa, or they'll lose to Wisconsin and they'll win the crossover game. I mean, I think 8-1 is certainly on the table, but I also think it's important to remember, and Punt John Punt, which is a great site that everybody should be following on social media that's been covering IU football from the analytics side for years. They noted that the most likely record from this point forward is actually 6-3, because the Penn State game could have easily, if the clock had been managed better by James Franklin, could have easily been a Penn State win. And now you're looking at a team that's 3-2 instead of 4-1. So it's important to not get caught up in the win total as much as in the way that the team's played overall. But I think this team's getting better every week. And so what I'm hopeful for is that what we saw against Penn State and even against Rutgers, that this team has shed that exoskeleton and is now like essentially a more improved version of itself as we head into this last 3-game stretch of the year. Obviously, health situation, who knows what to expect with all of that. Everything could change in a moment. But the way that things have gone so far, if we're just judging what's on the field, I like the direction that things have gone with IU.
All right, before I let you go, it would be an insult to the state of basketball to not ask you a question about basketball. It feels just better to talk about IU football right now, but basketball season tips off for both Indiana teams on Wednesday. Women's team takes on Eastern Kentucky. Men's team takes on Tennessee Tech. Just briefly, what are your expectations for both the men's and women's team this year for Indiana?
Look, I think the women are in great position to win a Big Ten title. They're projected to be the best team in the conference, which that's historic. And now it's like the development of the women's program under Terry Moran has been this very steady progression. They've had a couple of moments where it's been a step back, but then they've been able to take steps forward. I felt bad that they weren't able to reap the benefits of the outstanding year that they had last year. So look, I think they're the hunted this year. Like, everybody looks at IU and says that's the team to beat. That's a tough spot for a program like that to be in that really hasn't been there before. And so I think they'll probably struggle a little bit with those expectations early on, but I also think that it's a talented enough team and a well-coached enough team that they'll be able to handle them. So I think the first conference championship for IU is well within reach, and I won't be disappointed if they don't get there, but I'm fully expecting them to get there. As far as the men's team, it's interesting because I think it's the most talented and the most cohesive team that Archie Miller's had since he's been at IU. I think the problem that you run into is that nothing's happening in a vacuum in the conference, and there's teams that IU should probably be ahead of in the pecking order that have shot ahead of them in the last year or so. Illinois and Rutgers being the two that are the ones that I'd be most concerned about. I mean, Fran McCaffrey's had a long time at Iowa, and this looks like it might be the best team he's ever had at Iowa, and he doesn't fare well when his team is the front runner. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago they were supposed to be the best team in the conference, and I think they were a double-digit seed that year. They didn't have a very good year. But I think the question marks for Archie are what are you going to accomplish this year that's going to be significantly better than what was going to be accomplished last year? Last year's team was going to make the tournament. Okay, so let's just assume that was going to happen. What's the next step? How much better can you be with this particular personnel set? And I'm a little concerned because I've yet to see anything that really makes me think, all right, this is where this team makes a huge leap over the previous year. They were incrementally better last year, and I think that they deserve credit for that. But they were incrementally better over a team that missed the NCAA tournament. And that's like, at some point, the switch has to flip on, and it's got to be like, okay, this is Indiana basketball that we've seen in not too distant past. This is the Indiana basketball team that we've been promised. When does it actually start to take flight? You know, they're getting picked 7th or 8th in the conference by most every media observer. I think they got to finish, 4th or 5th. Like, I think they got to get into that third day of the tournament where they've got to bye. There's no reason why they shouldn't be at this point. And it's a tough conference, but this is Indiana. There are some standards, and at some point you got to start hitting those standards.
It's going to be an interesting season. It's certainly going to be an interesting rest of the way for IU football. Dr. Galen Clavio, I really appreciate you coming on. Great insight. A lot of fun today.
Thanks for having me on, Griffin, as always.
That will do it for today's episode of Unpaid Interns. Join us back again on Wednesday. We'll be talking some more college basketball with both the IU men's and women's season tipping off in college basketball across the country, tipping off Wednesday. Until then, for Dr. Galen Clavio, I'm Griffin Epstein. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again on Wednesday.